If you're like me, you've become acutely aware of the public perception of what homeschooling is and what homeschoolers do all day. And I should say it's a misconception because I think they've got it all wrong. In this COVID virus season that we're all in, where we're staying mainly at home and avoiding going out and spending time with friends or family as much as is possible, the media behind their comments, you can see they just perceive us staying at home anyway, so this has had no impact on traditional homeschoolers. Well, in a way, I think we really lost more than the traditionally schooled kids have, because if you're like me and my family, we spent lots of time going to the zoo, going to the legislature, going to parks and doing things outside. I dare say we probably do more field trips in a semester than our traditionally schooled neighbors have done. So I know that you, like us, are feeling the impacts of this time when we're sort of sequestered here at home. There are a few temptations that we face, I believe, with this loss of freedom, and that's really what it is. It's a loss of freedom. We can worry about the health of those people that we love, especially the older people, those that have underlying conditions. And as we hear more and more reports, we're even concerned about younger people as well, as they have a tough time with this disease. We can also begin to feel a little sorry for ourselves because of this loss. And this isolation, even on its face, can be pretty depressing, even if you're an introvert. There are many examples in Scripture of people that went through similar problems. The one that comes to my mind the most is the Apostle Paul. You may remember that Paul was taken under arrest for preaching the gospel. When he preached, it would impact businesses because people would quit frequenting soothsayers and others in town, or people that bought idols in certain cities in their form of pagan worship. And Paul had an impact on the economy, and very often he was harassed and he was arrested. Many times he was freed, but in this particular time in his life, he actually spent 2 years under house arrest in Rome, where he was not able to leave the house and had to stay there. It's amazing to think that during that time period of his life, he wrote letters that have become, to this day, so treasured by Christians. Let me also mention that, unlike us, Paul couldn't see much of a light at the end of the tunnel. Remember, at this day in Rome, they used to worship Caesar, and anybody that contradicted that had the threat of death upon them. Their sentencing was as brutal as their spectator sports were. You may have seen or read about how lions were set loose with convicts in the Colosseum, and people would come and watch those terrible events. Very, very brutal situation. So the thief on the cross beside Jesus illustrates this point. Can you imagine someone being put to death for stealing something? Well, this is the culture that the Apostle Paul found himself in. So I don't think Paul had quite the temporary view of the end that we do. This situation that we've got is temporary. I think it will be a season that we don't know how long it will last, but we know that there will be an end to it. The Apostle Paul, however, had to be concerned that his end could be death by crucifixion, even for preaching the gospel, something as minor as that. So Paul writes these 3 letters from prison, and an additional one to Philemon. He wrote to the Ephesian church, to the Philippian church, and to the Colossian church. The things Paul wrote about are just so encouraging and illustrative to us. So here's a man with a loss of freedom. Listen to what he writes to the church at Philippi in Philippians 2:13 through 16. For it is God who works in you, both to will and to do for his good pleasure. Do all things without complaining and disputing, that you may become blameless and harmless first generation, among whom you shine as the lights in the world, holding fast the word of life, so that I may rejoice in the day of Christ, that I have not run in vain or labored in vain. Boy, hadn't you been like me, tempted to do a little complaining, to being a little annoyed. And I think we are all tempted to a few more disputes in our households as we're with our families 24/7 now. In chapter 4, verse 4, he wrote, "Rejoice in the Lord always." Again, I say rejoice. Attitudes don't just happen to us, do they? They're influenced by our circumstances, but ultimately, we are in charge of our attitudes. We choose them. Paul goes further in Philippians 4:13-14. "For it is God who works in you, both to will and to do for his good pleasure. And again, do all things without complaint." A life of gratitude and service to others will keep us all young until we die, I think. Zan and I had great examples of this with our dads when we're tempted to get down or depressed, or if we have that child that's unmotivated and is beginning to turn inward. A great thing to do is to get us all to turn outward and to think about our communities and our churches. Both of our dads were great examples of this. Ann's dad was a community servant in many ways. He died at 97. My dad is 95 and still volunteers to answer the phone at his church one day a week. It's been a blessing to the church, but a bigger blessing probably to him, as it's gotten him something to look forward to in a way that he faces outward. I read about a pastor who had a 90-year-old blind man in his congregation whose wife had recently died. So he had to move into an assisted living home. When the pastor went to pick him up, he was fully dressed to the nines. And after many hours of waiting patiently in the lobby of the nursing home, he smiled when he was told his room was ready. As he maneuvered his walker to the elevator, the pastor provided a visual description of his tiny room, including the sheets that had been hung on his window. And right in the middle of this description, the man said, "I love it." And he had the enthusiasm of an 8-year-old that had just been given a new puppy. The pastor said, "Mr. Jones, you haven't even seen the room yet or been here. How can you love it?" The man said, "That doesn't have anything to do with it. Happiness is something you decide on ahead of time. Whether I like my room or not doesn't really depend on how the furniture is arranged, or it's how I arrange it in my mind. It's how I arrange it in my mind. I already have decided to love it. It's a decision I make every morning when I wake up. I have a choice. I can spend the day in bed recounting the difficulty I have with the parts of my body that no longer work, or get out of bed and be thankful for the ones that do. Each day is a gift, and as long as my eyes are open, I'll focus on the new day and all the happy memories I've stored away just for this time in my life. Old age is like a bank account. You withdraw from what you've put in. So my advice to you would be to deposit a lot of happiness in the bank account of memories. Thank you for your part in filling my memory bank. I am still depositing." Good night. What an example to us all. Psalm 16:11 says, "You will fill me with joy in your presence." In the same way we find joy in God's presence in our lives, our children find joy in being with us. You know, Robert Frost and his wife were homeschoolers. He was a recipient of 4 Pulitzer Prizes, and he believed in education by presence. He actually, in his daily routine, he would spend the day with his family and would stay up most of the night writing and then take a nap in the afternoon. He wrote, "Learning both delight and instruct." In his homeschool, Frost emphasized the local and the immediate, the surroundings and the season. Boy, that describes our lives right now, doesn't it? We have such a unique season that we're going through and will continue to go through. Let me encourage you with some practical things as you're sequestered there at home as we are. Don't be afraid to shake up your routine and try to do more fun things together with your kids that will delight and instruct. This opportunity won't really last forever, as once the checkered flag has dropped, I see everybody getting back to their busy lives. Here's some ideas that I think can bring joy to you and your family. A big project and a worthy one is to write a family history. I would recommend you divide up roles among your kids, and you have to obviously govern this by their skill levels. But think about the different roles a newspaper has an executive editor, writers, copy editors, marketing, layout, printing, distribution. Have a pitch meeting where you kick this idea off with your team. And I can see the need there for a project manager, a timeline, a schedule. What's the end product going to be stored on? Is it going to be Microsoft Word or Pages? Will it be PowerPoint? Will it be video? This will give your team a vision for the result. The other nice thing about this project is it can encourage your friends and family as well, because many of the interviews will be with your grandparents. Call them on the phone. Use it as an opportunity to teach phone etiquette for your kids. Have them develop questions that they want to ask your grandparents, and even try to contact some of their friends. You can take down that picture on the wall that you may have, or in an album somewhere, of the wedding of your parents, your kids' grandparents. See who the best men were in those pictures. See who the maid of honor is. Maybe they're still around. Maybe you can interview them as well and get stories about your parents and grandparents. Interview aunts and uncles. Draw a family tree. And along the way, I would recommend to document your family's spiritual heritage. It's interesting. I found a diary from one of my uncles as he was dying. His wife recorded sort of a little family history. And one of the things he said that was fascinating to me was that there was a revival in town, and him being one of the older brothers was kind of commissioned by the family to go check it out. And sadly, my Uncle John came back and said that he didn't go forward, and he decided that we should all just try to be good people. Sort of a sad commentary, but an important one in my family's history for me to remember, as many others of them became Christians, some later in life, some after the war, and many of them were Christians. A couple of tools you can use that will help you along the way. I mentioned the wedding pictures of your parents and grandparents. Photo albums, obviously. And another little tool that I find very helpful are recipe books. If you're like me, you've got recipe books laying around and maybe cards from your parents and grandparents. There's nothing to bring back memories like looking at recipes or thinking about times you had together as a family. Crucifixion, Christ had the Last Supper where he instituted communion. It appeals to all the senses, and in the same way, when you appeal to all the senses, you create memories that last a lifetime. Another thing you can do is a little bit doesn't require quite as much planning maybe or time, is to have a story time at a certain time of the day. Kids love to hear stories of your growing up years, or maybe your parents' growing up years. I know that I used to have stories that I made up for my kids when they went to bed, and now my grandkids. And very often they'll say, "Tell me a story about my dad." And so I'll tell them a story about their dad's growing up years, and they're fascinated by those. It's never too late to write those down either, because once someone is gone, they are gone, and it is great to capture those when they're still fresh in your mind. My dad had 6 brothers, and they were all storytellers. At family reunions, I love to sit around and listen to them swap stories. My dad attempted to write some of them down one time as sort of a legacy for us, And he would always precede the story with stuff like, now, I think this is true, or this is mainly true, or I think part of this is true. One of my favorites was when he and his brothers were at a square dance at a friend's house when he was a teenager. Now, my grandfather was a square dance caller. And very often, communication being what it was in those days, a wagon would come by, or maybe a wealthy person that actually had a car in the community would come by to pick him up, to take him to be a caller at a square dance at someone's house. My dad and as many of his brothers as could get dressed and fit into the wagon were able to go. So one time, my dad and some of his teenage brothers were at one of these parties. They used to actually have to move the furniture, sometimes on the front porch, roll up the rug to create a dance floor. And the mothers that had young infants would often put them in an upper room on a bed somewhere. So imagine a scene late at night where this dance is going on a Friday or Saturday night. And so my mischievous dad and his brothers sneak upstairs to find a bed full of 4 or 5 babies. Well, they swap the babies around and change their clothes so that at the end of the party, many of the people went home with the wrong child. It would be dark when they left, and you know how it is when you pick up a sleeping infant. You do everything in the world to keep that infant from seeing any light. So I'm sure they were covered up till they got home. And my dad and his brothers would always tell that story and laugh about wondering who raised the wrong child. This becomes sort of part of family lore. Another thing you can do is to develop sort of a COVID-19 diary. I would give it a different name, but I think we'll look back on this time and think about the things that we did, maybe the board games we played that we never seemed to have time to play. So I would recommend possibly keeping a diary during this time. This world of screens and Netflix, I think it'd be a very welcome distraction. Another great opportunity we have, even though we're sequestered like we are, is some observation at night. Get blankets and snacks and stay up late and go outside and lay on the ground and try to identify constellations, stars, and planets. You can certainly get an app that can tell you what those are, or online. There's tons of resources to guide you through that. And if you have a telescope, use it. If you don't, I dare say the binoculars you have at home are probably about as powerful as what Copernicus used in his early days. Watch a sunrise together. You can nap as a family later, but that'll be an interesting memory if it's not something that you've done usually. Plant a garden. It can be small or large. Use this as an opportunity to teach botany and history through it. History, because after World War II, you may remember that there were victory gardens that all the families planted as they came back. And the baby boom generation resulted from this great ocean, millions of men coming back from war in World War II. As they got married, they planted victory gardens and they began their families. Another thing you can do with this time is to really organize toys in closets. You finally have time to do that. It's funny, a friend of ours said, you know, I was always looking forward to having time to really doing all this work around the house. And now I realize time wasn't the problem. Now that she was having time, she was realizing it was more procrastination than time. That was the issue. Couple of things about organizing toys. One time at the beach, my youngest granddaughter was being born, so we took my 3 grandsons to the beach who were like 5, 7, and 9. And I needed to get them to police up all their wet bathing suits that had been left all over this house we were renting. So I came up with a game to try to make it fun. I called it the Awesome Game. And I hyped it hours ahead of time. You know, this afternoon at 3, we're going to play the Awesome Game. It's going to be so awesome. So the youngest really got excited about it. The other 2 were less excited, but looking forward to it. So the awesome game was to walk around and pick up all their dirty bathing suits laying everywhere and get their clothes ready to be washed. And finally, my 5-year-old was really excited about it until we got about halfway through it, and he just stopped and looked at me and he said, "Oh, these are just chores. This is not an awesome game." Anyway, have fun with your kids. Feel free to mess with them. My granddaughter, Tristan, is hilarious. She, as a little girl, her mom would always sing this song, and they would gather up all the toys, and they sang this little song, "Clean Up, Clean Up." Well, Tristan kind of got words and music mixed up, and so she used to sing, "Gather up the toys that you see. He is holy. He is holy." Anyway, I got such a kick out of it. So write down these things. I remember my dad used to tell me when my kids were real young, "Boy, Joe, you need to be writing this down. You need to write this thing or that thing down." Well, you've got time to do that. Maybe every evening after dinner, sit around and write down some of the funny things that happen during the day. Another thing you can do to face outward a little bit is to think about those in your church. I bet you've got firemen you've got first responders in your church, probably. You probably have nurses, maybe doctors. If not, maybe you have neighbors that are nurses and doctors, first responders. You can have your kids write them letters, draw them pictures, maybe posters with encouraging words on them. Something that gets them to focus outside your home and into the community, I think, is a great thing to do. Do yard work or shopping if you can for sick or elderly. One blessing of this thing so far has been the way people are looking out for each other. And I know in our neighborhood, there's a lady that has contacted just about every neighbor, especially the elderly, to find out if there's anything she can pick up while she's at the store. Have your kids do yard work for neighbors that may be sick. Serving together on a project like that really does bring joy. You know, these have been sad, hard days for our country and even for the entire world. Your children need you to bring hope and a sense of normalcy to their lives. There's plenty of sadness and many things to pray about, but don't feel guilty for bringing joy into your kids' lives, obviously. I'm reminded of Nehemiah 8, 9, and 10 at a particularly sad time in the life of the children of Israel. Says, then Nehemiah, the governor, Ezra the priest and teacher of the law, and the Levites who were instructing the people said to them, "This day is holy to the Lord your God. Do not mourn or weep," even though they had much to mourn or weep about. For all the people had been weeping as they listened to the words of the law. Nehemiah said, "Go and enjoy choice food and sweet drinks and send some to those who have nothing prepared. This day is holy to the Lord our God. Do not grieve, for the joy of the Lord is your strength." In the midst of the Israelites' sorrow, God told them, "The joy of the Lord is your strength." This brings us full circle, really, as we remember Paul rejoicing and encouraging others to rejoice while he was under home arrest. Let me end with this story. A New York pastor was visiting a homebound elderly lady in his church who was dying of an incurable disease. It was one that was very, very painful, and she was obviously in pain all the time. When he asked her how bad her pain was, she said, "It's nothing that the resurrection cannot fix." As you spend time with your family this resurrection week, may it be one where you and yours gain a deeper appreciation for that day when he will wipe away every tear. Our faith will be turned to sight, and we will all experience true joy indeed. Let's close in prayer. Father, how we thank you for your word and the example of so many in history that instruct us. We thank you for the Apostle Paul and all that you wrote through him. Grant that you may instruct our families through us and encourage them to have joy in a time of sorrow. Lord, help us to make the best use of this time and be found faithful as to how we spend this precious commodity of time and energy that we have in these days. We thank you for all these things in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, who ever lives to intercede for us at your right hand. Amen.